Okay, looks like our recording is going. All right, great. Thanks so much, everybody, for joining us. I help to coordinate the Human Trafficking Task Force meetings along with our Sexual Violence Prevention team, Mary Hopkins and Marissa Raggett, as well as Injury and Violence Prevention Unit Supervisor Beatrice Menento. Thank you for joining us this morning. As you sign in, please be sure to introduce yourselves in the chat and let us know where you're from. Please note that today, unfortunately, we do not have closed captioning. However, it will be available on the recording. We should have it back up for the next meeting in January. The Minnesota Human Trafficking Task Force is an informal statewide network made up of people from around the state. The purpose of the task force is to address human trafficking in Minnesota through services, response, and prevention. This includes sex trafficking and sexual exploitation and labor trafficking and exploitation of individuals of all ages. We convene these quarterly meetings, which include a number of presentations to keep us all informed, especially during this time when we cannot meet together in person. While we cannot have an in-person discussion, we encourage you to send chat questions throughout the presentations, and we will answer them or follow up. And by the way, we do expect that the virtual Human Trafficking Task Force meetings will likely be continuing into the spring. We have over 1,300 people from around the state and outside of Minnesota who are signed up on the task force list, the Sex and Labor Trafficking Prevention Network listserv called MNSTPN, MNSTPN, and the Facebook page. Please sign up on these lists if you're not already on them to receive updates. Our meetings are recorded, and the recordings are made available on the Trafficking Task Force website about a week after each meeting. We will send an email out announcing that it's available. Today, we have two very important presentations. First, we'll have a presentation about a new report from the Minnesota Coalition Against Sexual Assault about developing and implementing an authentic response to Safe Harbor, specifically improving access to Safe Harbor for all youth, including communities of color, LGBTQ+, and Two-Spirit youth, and male youth. Hunter will go over the highlights from the report today, and it will be available soon. And again, that's Hunter Beckstrom, who's from MNCASA. And then next, we're going to hear from Darian McCormick and Sarah Ladd from the Safe Harbor response at the Department of Human Services. They will be giving important updates about the state's progress in complying with the Federal Family First Prevention Services Act. For both presentations, we welcome questions and comments in the chat. After the presentations, I will provide a brief Safe Harbor update. Thank you again for joining us this morning, and I'm going to turn things over to Hunter Beckstrom for his presentation. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Can folks hear me? All right, wonderful. Thanks so much, Caroline. So very excited to be here with you all today. So just to share a little bit about myself. So once again, Hunter Beckstrom, and I'm the Prevention and Sexual Exploitation Specialist at the Minnesota Coalition Against Sexual Assault. And a little bit about my role here in Safe Harbor is that I provide technical assistance to our different Safe Harbor protocol teams across the state of Minnesota. And what that technical assistance really looks like is offering different resources, trainings, and webinars in terms of the realities of trafficking and exploitation, looking at trying to gain some community buy-in, also doing some evaluation work, and then also teaming as well. But the reason that I'm here to talk to you today, as Caroline had mentioned, was through my work with these Safe Harbor protocol teams, I was able to take the lead on a project that was thankfully funded by the Minnesota Department of Health. And I'm really trying to determine better ways for teams to be able to engage more effectively with their communities. So let me see if I can advance the slides here. Okay, perfect. And so this report was the Authentic Community Engagement in Safe Harbor report. And as Caroline had mentioned, that is going to be released very shortly. So please be on the lookout for that being spread out across our different networks here in Safe Harbor. And I do want to be honest, this wasn't necessarily a huge groundbreaking report by any means, but I do think it was very, and it will be very beneficial for a few different reasons. And so number one, looking at the fact that being very timely due to some of the realities of conflict between our systems and community members, but also the fact that this offers some very practical strategies for Safe Harbor service providers And then, of course, through that vein, obviously being able to continue supporting victims and survivors as well. And so just to offer folks a brief agenda for our time today, wanted to really break down the major themes of this report. So obviously looking at the purpose, diving into some of the results and limitations, and then finally finishing up with some recommendations that came out of some of the feedback from the participants of this. And I know that we have about half an hour, and I do want to see if we can leave, about 3 minutes left for any questions that folks might have, but also feel free to throw anything in the chat, and I'll be happy to try to answer that for folks as well. All right, so getting into the purpose here of the general project overall. So that was really to identify ways in which stakeholders within Safe Harbor, and by stakeholders, we meant the Safe Harbor protocol teams, but then also essentially anyone underneath the umbrella of Safe Harbor services as well, but also grantors with Safe Harbor too. So once again, just to reiterate, identifying ways in which these stakeholders can really try to increase their capacity to continue centering marginalized voices and survivors within their work. And the two main frameworks in which we decided to go through with this was obviously number one, to listen to and interview a culturally specific Safe Harbor service programs, and then also number two, to directly hear from youth with lived experiences. And so obviously, both of these factors are kind of no-brainers when we're really trying to center those who are most impacted, who have lived experiences of trafficking and exploitation as well. All right, so now just kind of getting into the general results of this project overall is number one, the project timeline for the interview specifically, it was between the months of February to May of 2021. And we did have the opportunity to interview 11 total youth as well. And there were 6 total different culturally specific organizations that were represented as well. And just to list off the different communities that these organizations specifically offered services to, that was the Latinx community, Southeast Asian community, the immigrant community, LGBTQIA+ folks, Native American folks, and then finally folks in the Black community as well. So those were the 6 communities represented within this report. And through these 6 organizations, there was actually 13 different participating staff members as well. And so just a couple more points on this results section is that we were able to compensate all the folks as well. So all of the culturally specific organizations, and then also the youth survivors that participated as well. And overall, we really tried to emphasize a non-metrocentric emphasis during our reporting. So we really tried to gain some voices and wisdom from all across the different counties and regions of Minnesota as well. And so kind of going into the next few slides here, we're going to be breaking down some of the different aspects of the results and questions for both the youth interviews, and then following up with the culturally specific interview questions as well. All right, so here with our youth interviews, these are the 3 prepared questions that were sent out to all of the youth that we interviewed. So obviously we did that so they could get a feeling for the general project itself and be prepared about any questions that they might be asked as well. And so similar to the overall purpose of our project overall, we also had different goals for our different interviewee groups. And so in terms of the youth interviews, our goal was really to determine youth experiences with systems, but also more specifically, how to properly implement youth survivor voices into our protocol development as well. And as I'm sure most folks can imagine, we really tried to make sure that youth could really wrap their head around this project overall and make sure that it wasn't jargony or very academic as well. So we really tried to emphasize these ideas of storytelling, for instance, right? And so kind of explaining what Safe Harbor is, what these Safe Harbor protocol teams are, and then obviously how their role is impacting this as well. So really making sure that this was a very inclusive experience for the youth so they could really understand the whole project itself. Now jumping into some of the results of the youth interviews. So obviously just to reiterate, the 3 main questions were discipline, collaboration, whether systems took into account background and experiences of youth, and then also how youth wanted their voices to be heard Looking at that first question, overall, the responses were quite mixed for youth. So obviously we had youth who were saying that, there is a great collaboration between organizations, but at the same time, on the opposite end of the spectrum, we had youth saying that there was a complete lack of communication, right? But one kind of caveat on this first question is the fact that, it's very likely that youth were not privy to all of the communication or general goings on of what was going on with their case, right? And so they probably got little snippets here and there of what was going on, but they probably obviously weren't sitting in meetings, right? So I do think that was a little bit difficult for you to be able to truthfully answer this first question about discipline collaboration. And secondly, looking at whether systems took into account background and experiences for youth. Once again, youth were very mixed on this response. So there's a lot of youth who said that specific disciplines really encouraged and celebrated their backgrounds or their experiences. But on the other hand, it was the complete opposite, where some disciplines were at times overtly sexist or racist or transphobic, for instance. And this was, very sad to hear, very frustrating as well, right? Because I think within Safe Harbor, we've really worked for a long time trying to make sure that we are really grounded, if folks are familiar, really being grounded within the 5 main principles of what are in the Safe Harbor Protocol guidelines. So that is being victim-centered, being trauma-informed, youth-centered, strengths-based, and then finally being culturally responsive. And so obviously there's tons of people and service providers that are doing this work each and every single day, and they're fantastic, right? But just these 2 first questions, looking at these fundamental aspects of response, goes to show that hearing directly from youth that we still have to do a lot of improving, right? And so just making sure that we really are grounded in those 5 principles when we are responding to youth with lived experiences as well. And then finally, arguably, one of the most important pieces of this entire report is asking youth how they want their voices to be heard, right? So as you can see, the different potential methods of engagement that youth really outlined was youth advisory boards, having teams create a unique position on their team that was specifically for a youth representative, also having some stakeholder interviews, and then also surveys where youth could respond anonymously in these different ways too. But as you can see from the bolded text on this slide is the fact that youth were most interested in having some type of youth advisory board on these teams, right? And there's actually 2 specific youth that had shared experiences that they had actually in the past sat on youth advisory boards. And one of these youth in particular said that it was one of the most empowering experiences that they've ever had. And I think that piece is very important here, right? Because we're kind of getting 2 birds with 1 stone, for instance, right? Because not only are we grounding our response as it needs to be when we are grounding and listening directly from youth with lived experiences, but also we are empowering and uplifting them in these experiences, right? So we're doing both of these things simultaneously. So I think that piece is very important here. And then also that second bullet point, you can see that one youth shared that having the opportunity to really have these youth advisory boards really creates opportunities to have these raw, difficult conversations between youth and these disciplines on the teams, right? And so I think in this way, youth can really try to have these different systems providers really take accountability and responsibility for their response and making sure it is really grounded within those 5 guiding principles of our Safe Harbor Protocol guidelines, because it's very important to have these very difficult but very necessary conversations, right? And then finally, one piece that we did not directly ask youth about, but that had kind of come up regardless for just about every single youth we interviewed, was really a desire for youth autonomy. And I think importantly, this wasn't necessarily the fact that youth wanted to make all the decisions for themselves or completely ignore, different rules and procedures from a shelter, for instance, but instead really kind of looking at the fact that, they wanted to assist in making choices for themselves and assist in that decision-making process. Because if you think about it in the example of a youth is in the life and out on the streets, oftentimes they're making decisions for their own survival each and every single day, constantly, right? And then they might come into contact with a system, and a lot of that agency might be taken away, right? And so really being able to balance some of those aspects, of course, youth being needing to follow some different protocols and guidelines within these different systems, but making sure that they're going to be empowered and uplifted by that experience as well. Excuse me. So just getting into some of the quotations that I wanted to share from the youth on their reports. And once again, when folks do see this, there's going to be literally dozens of different quotations spread out through here, but these are just two really powerful quotes that I wanted to share in this PowerPoint with you all today. And so number one, one youth said, "I had to explain to a caseworker that I'm literally living in a car and my whole situation is extremely stressful, so my brain isn't necessarily focused on, oh, well, let me email my caseworker and let me keep in contact with her because I'm in survival mode. I have to make sure I'm okay, and I'm constantly in this state of survival." And number two, every voice is important, every story is important, and no matter what, everyone deserves compassion, and that you can truthfully learn so much from every situation. Take every situation as I can learn something new from this. And I think in particular that first quotation really goes to show oftentimes we ask youth survivors to jump through hoop after hoop after hoop. And if we're really not making sure or being aware of the fact that youth aren't even having their basic needs being met, how are we going to have these expectations that they have to follow through with all of these different aspects, right? And so number two, looking at that other quotation, being aware of the fact that we truly can learn something new from all of these interactions with youth, whether that's picking up on new trends of youth being in the life or red flags, or just building some of that rapport. And so kind of going back to those first two questions on discipline, collaboration, and if systems are taking into account background and experiences, once again, people are doing fantastic work, but we still really have to ground our response in those 5 guiding principles once again. And so now the next couple of slides are going to be taking a deep dive into our culturally specific interview questions. So you can see those 4 questions here on the slide. But in addition, as I had mentioned, that there was a general goal for our youth interview questions, our goal for culturally specific interviews was 1, to identify the inconsistencies experienced both by the organizations themselves, but then also the individuals that they served. And then finally, how these organizations really would like to be in community with teams as well. And so just a couple of caveats that I really wanted to outline before diving into some of the results here is number 1, asking what are the unique needs of the communities that you serve. That is not highlighted or talked about in depth in the reports, and obviously we won't discuss that here. And that's mostly because, for instance, the report is about 30 pages. We just wouldn't have the amount of time or pages to really do it justice about explaining all of these 6 different communities and their different dynamics and experiences. And I'll just repeat those communities that were represented. And once again, so there's the Latinx community, Southeast Asian community, immigrant community, LGBTQIA+ folks, Native American folks, and then also folks in the Black community. So we really wouldn't just be able to do it justice in the reports or within the presentation here again today. And then one last caveat is just due to some time constraints with the interviews, oftentimes questions 3 and 4 were oftentimes merged together. Alrighty, so jumping into some of the results here, wanted to share kind of breaking down the different discrepancies that the culturally specific organizational participants really highlighted. So number 1, there was a huge aspect of these transactional relationships or weighted exchanges. So kind of putting this into an example is the fact that maybe a certain discipline or maybe an entire team would reach out to a culturally specific organization because they're realizing a lot of members from a certain community were reaching out and they wanted to have some resources and expertise, right? And I think that's a very typical example of what happens. but oftentimes the relationship is ended there, the participants explained. And so, first of all, you would think that, you know, if an organization is seeing a lot of these different members from a certain community, you would want to have that relationship be in place, right? But also acknowledging the fact that there was oftentimes not any type of benefiting factor for culturally specific organizations. And so really being honest about having more meaningful relationships with culturally specific organizations is what they were advocating for. Additionally, another discrepancy was this feeling of like they were an afterthought. So for instance, whether culturally specific organizations just were not invited to the table or were only invited after the facts or only felt like they were there to, you know, get a check mark on the box, for instance, right? So really making sure that, for instance, one team that I have been working with, you know, during their very first meeting together, they asked the question, who is not here and needs to be here? And I think that piece is very important. So grounding our work within some of those ideas. And then also a general disregard for their work. I think that's oftentimes typical within advocacy work. But then additionally, even more so for folks who are at culturally specific organizations. And then finally, oftentimes there is a misunderstanding of services on behalf of culturally specific organizations as well. And the common example here was the fact that, you know, if culturally specific organizations typically worked with community members that English was not a primary language, for instance, there's a perception that that organization was also a language line, for instance. But I think, you know, while that sometimes is the case, we should not have that assumption, right? And we have to acknowledge the fact that culturally specific organizations are advocates and they're doing advocacy work just like all of us. So really being aware of these different discrepancies and trying to eliminate a lot of these as well. On the second point here with culturally specific protocol development, this is obviously really the whole general purpose of this report, and obviously the title of it really once again emphasizing this idea of authentic community engagement, right? And if there's any type of you know, small sentence that I can really pull out of the entire report or all of these interviews that I had the honor of doing, was really the fact that someone said, you can't save us without us. And I think, you know, that little piece in and of itself is, you know, it's so simple, but yet very powerful at the same time, right? Because if you are not grounding your response in, you know, centering marginalized voices who are most impacted by trafficking and exploitation, you're not really doing justice to that response, right? So making sure that you are doing that response for the community, but it's also by the community as well. And one last point here, talking about on behalf of the culturally specific organizational participants, also saying to avoid tokenism. So, participants were saying that they wanted to have themselves on that team, but also making sure that that representative from that culturally specific organization cannot have all the same experiences or cannot speak on behalf of that entire community, right? And so I think it's important that because that representative is on the team, there is that connection to the community, but that should not fall solely on that representative, right? It has to come as a team solution, right? Really working with that community as an entire team rather than one sole representative. Alrighty now, so getting into some of the additional themes that came out of the answers, just like the youth interview questions. First and foremost, really wanted to touch on this idea of equitable funding for culturally specific organizations. And one piece you might recall that at the beginning of the presentation, I said that all the youth were either found through Safe Harbor Services or all the culturally specific organizations were funded by Safe Harbor. And that is true for all but one of the culturally specific organizations. And that was the representative agency for the Black community. And that was just because there is essentially no identifiable organization that specifically represented the Black community that had received Safe Harbor funding. And I think this piece is really important about having this idea of equitable funding for culturally specific organizations, right? And one participant statement, I think, really wraps up this idea perfectly. And so they said, in my experience, what I have seen is that culturally specific programs are the ones with the least amount of funding, resources, and access. And these things make our work incredibly unsustainable, but more importantly, it really limits what we are able to do. And so this aspect really goes to show that, I mean, obviously across the board, a lot of nonprofits have issues with funding, but once again, this funding has to be equitable, right? It has to be able to work with our culturally specific organizations because they have resources, knowledge, and expertise that not all of our agencies have, right? So really being able to have this idea of equitable funding. But number two, another additional theme that I think is hugely important to be able to share is this idea of white supremacy and systemic oppression that is so incredibly present within our society. And I think, this reality was very difficult for a number of our participants, just because of the current realities, but also because of the timing of some of the interviews as well. For instance, we had some of the interviews take place in April and May of 2021. And if folks recall, at the time, there was the current events of the killing of Dante Wright, but then also the upcoming anniversary of George Floyd's murder as well. So obviously that was very heavy on the minds of some of these participants. But all of this goes to show that, honestly, we need to acknowledge that systems, including the systems that we work with day in and day out, have historically caused harm in, countlessly severe ways to victims and survivors. And that harm continues today, right? That's, the example of youth sharing that there were specific disciplines that were outright racist or transphobic to them, right? And that just goes to show that there are still huge impacts of white supremacy and systemic oppression that we really have to eliminate in our society and in our systems. And so just a couple of quotations that I wanted to share from our culturally specific organizations. Number one, someone said that unless you are an organization or system that is specifically set up to treat and to address and to partner and to sojourn with the community in terms of healing from sexual violence, most systems have a built-in prejudice and have a disrespect and disregard for victims of sexual violence. And number two, we deal with multiple pandemics, not only the shootings from the police, but also the intrinsic violence that is happening because of the unaddressed trauma in our communities. And so I think, on that first quotation, just to be honest, I would say that the vast majority of systems are not built whatsoever to really support victims and survivors. So we really have to be aware of that fact, because as participants within these systems, we really need to work to take accountability and responsibility for this historical harm, but also the harm that is continuing today. But additionally, we really need to build community and relationships in order to try to work to eliminate white supremacy and systemic oppression, because not only does it harm victims and survivors and some of these communities as well, but it also helps to serve ourselves because it's dehumanizing practices that hurts all of us, right? And so really working to take this idea of responsibility and accountability and working to overturn and eliminate some of these behaviors as well. And so just to reiterate, this is really talked more at length in the report, but obviously really wanted to make sure to touch on that here today with all of you. And so, just very powerful feedback from these participants, and was very, very happy to see some of these additional themes come out, because it's very, very crucial to a lot of the lived realities of our youth survivors that we work with, but also the culturally specific organizations that we need to be partnering with as well. All right, so now just got a couple of slides left that I wanted to share, and then we can get into some Q&A if folks have any of that, but did want to talk about some limitations of this report. So overall, honestly, there was a small pool of participants. We were certainly hoping to get more youth involved, and then also culturally specific organizations. But we can certainly speculate at the fact that this was largely due to obviously our ongoing pandemic, and knowing that folks were just stretched very thin, being both service providers and youth survivors themselves. We also had a pretty big lack of diversity. I think we actually did have three demographic questions that we asked our youth survivors. So number one, how you identify with your gender, how you identify with your race and your age. And I think it was actually very amazing to see that based on that second question about how they identify with their race, actually 9 out of the 11 individuals that we interviewed for youth identified as Black, Indigenous, or people of color. So I do think that aspect was very important to be apparent within our report here. But just the fact that so many more identities and backgrounds have to be present within this research as well. And then finally, there was honestly a bit of a narrow scope of experience with systems on behalf of the youth. So I think the vast majority of youth had shared experiences that were either dealing with advocacy / shelter organizations and law enforcement. But one small caveat to that piece is I think, for instance, with these larger shelters that youth might have been at, obviously there's multidisciplinary services at times. So obviously there's advocacy. We have some different caseworkers or social workers. We might have healthcare providers. We might have drug abuse counselors, anything like that, right? And so there truly are multidisciplinary services within those spaces. But for instance, youth might have just seen that as one certain shelter experience or shelter service, for instance. And then finally, just to wrap up with our general recommendations based on the feedback from youth survivors and our culturally specific organizations was number one, obviously, to have authentic community engagement. It really begins with having those critical conversations between the system service providers and our community members. We also want to make sure to develop meaningful partnerships within the community. Number three, a clear line of communication extending from the team to all facets of the community. So that is looking at the team itself, going back to those home organizations that are part of the team in general, and then finally to the community as well. Number four, to propose for greater allocation of funding for culturally specific organizations. And then finally, boldly work to eradicate white supremacy and systemic forms of oppression. And once again, obviously, we want to do all 5 of these factors at the same time, right? And obviously, the report goes a little bit deeper into our recommendations here, but just once again, want to thank all of our youth survivor participants and our culturally specific organizations that really took part in this report, and obviously, making sure that, rewarding them for their expertise and their wisdom. It was definitely an honor being able to work with those folks here. And once again, please be on the lookout for this report in the future as we kind of release it out to our different networks, hopefully within the next month here. But hopefully there's a couple of more minutes. Caroline, I'm not sure if I'm a little over. My apologies if I am, but did want to answer any questions that folks might have had. But you can see on the slide here, here's my information that you can contact me if you do have any questions once you see the report, or of course, if you are interested in any type of technical assistance in terms of trafficking and exploitation, and also with our different safe harbor protocol teams across the state as well.
Oh, this is terrific. Thank you so much, Hunter. And this is Caroline again. I want to see if anybody has any comments or insights or reactions to the report that Hunter presented. You can put them in the chat and we will read them out or ask Hunter questions. Maybe while we're waiting for that to happen, Hunter, I'm kind of thinking about big picture here for Safe Harbor, and as we continue to work in the future and plan around, really what the next decade of Safe Harbor is going to look like. And what do you think we can take away from this report in order to, really set the next decade for Safe Harbor being as equitable and as inclusive as possible?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Caroline. I think it really goes to start off with really acknowledging those ideas of harm that systems have done, right? And I think that, it's not just always a couple of different systems, it's all systems that are doing this harm. And we really have to work to not only acknowledge that, but being able to once again look at that systemic oppression and be able to combat against that. And so really listening to victims and survivors who are youth, but then also our culturally specific organization, organizations to be able to repair some of the harm that has been done, because some of this is very active harm, right? And so we have to be able to first repair some of that and make sure that there's going to be some community collaboration and engagement to first be able to, do that work in the first place, right? So making sure that repair is being done within all of our communities before some of that authentic community engagement can really happen. And then once again, really listening directly to youth victims and survivors and our culturally specific organizations to overall have this holistic approach to be able to kind of turn on the light bulb or lens to be able to see all of these different types of systemic oppression and be able to combat that while at the same time really responding in, once again, those 5 guiding principles of the Safe Harbor Protocol guidelines. Because I think, we can't just do this work to combat white supremacy or systemic oppression with just systems or just community. It has to be a holistic approach that everyone is doing that work together.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Hunter. Really appreciate it. I know we're going to be drawing on this report quite a bit as we go through the next steps of planning for the future of Safe Harbor. So I just really want to thank you again for all of your work and effort, and for bringing in the survivor voice and the youth voice to help give us better direction. Did anybody else have a question or comment? Darianne, I saw you pop on. I'm not sure if you were going to ask a question. Oh, maybe not. Okay. All right. Well,
Sorry.
so there you are, Darianne. Did you have a question?
Yeah, no, I did not. I was checking my camera and then I couldn't unmute to answer you, but I also was typing in the chat. Great presentation, Hunter. Thank you very much, and great research.
Thank you so
Great.
much, everyone.
Thank you, Darianne. And so, Hunter, we can expect to see the report within the next month?
Correct. It should be about that timing. And once again, would love to be able to send it out to all of our networks. If, Caroline or Paula would be able to send that out to folks, that would be super appreciated.
Yeah, absolutely. We will make sure that everybody gets it. All right. Thank you so much, Hunter. We really appreciate it. All right. I'm going to turn things over to Darianne McCormick and Sarah Ladd to talk about Family First.
All right. Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Sarah Ladd, and I am joined here today by my co-human trafficking child protection coordinator, Darianne McCormick. And we are going to be talking with you. Hello, Darianne. We are going to be talking with you this morning about a really big federal law that is having quite a large impact here in Minnesota. It is called the Family First Prevention Services Act, and it went into effect on September 30th. So if this is the first time that you are hearing about Family First in detail, know that it has been kind of a long process since January of 2018 to try and pull together all of what we're going to share with you today and much, much more. There is the Family First Prevention Services Act. You'll hear about just the residential services or placement side related to trafficked, exploited, and at-risk youth today, but there is a lot more. So in the future, as Safe Harbor intersects with some of the other pieces of this law, we may have opportunity to share about some of the other pieces, such as the placement prevention services side. So with that, we are going to jump in and let me see, do I have control of the slides here or what's happening with the slides?
Hi, Sarah.
Sorry.
You are the presenter, so you do have control of the slides. You can find the arrows to the left of the slides on your screen.
Okay. Sorry, everyone, that I don't know what's going on. Oh, there's a little 01. Next page. Got it. Okay. Thank you so much. Sorry about that. Okay. So just to situate us here, we are talking about the child protection response to trafficking and exploitation of children and youth. Okay. And so Safe Harbor, our broad response to trafficking and exploitation of children and youth, has, in addition to the child protection response, which is actually the most recent addition to our response, we have, of course, the decriminalization and the Safe Harbor network of services and protocol and all of that work. And thank you, Hunter, for your presentation on that as well. So we view, Darian and I very much view the development of the child welfare system response to trafficking as being under the broad umbrella of Minnesota's response to trafficked and exploited youth. So working together in tandem, trying to create the type of response that we want that fulfills our no wrong door values here in Minnesota. Okay, so all right, so just one more brief recap to situate us. If you are new to the child welfare response, it did go into effect in May of 2017. All child sex trafficking here in Minnesota is a form of sexual abuse and child abuse and neglect, and it does require an investigation by Child Protection, in addition to any law enforcement related investigation that might be going on in relation to the incidents of sex trafficking. So I want to make one quick, I kept this sliding, so I want to make one quick modification. If you attended the July meeting, Caroline mentioned about the third track proposal, which is the non-caregiver sex trafficking assessment track. And that proposal did move forward. It did have a hearing last session, and it was included in the final House omnibus bill, but it did not pass. It was not included by the Senate. So what you see on the screen right now, the child protection investigation response for all forms of sex trafficking, including sex trafficking by non-caregiver alleged offenders, is still the current law in Minnesota. There are bills live going into the next session to try and change that, but that has not passed at this point. Okay, so and I'm happy to answer questions about that or about any of this. Darian and I both can answer questions throughout if folks want to put them in the chat or at the end also. So feel free to jump in. Okay, so back to this for just a moment here. So all sex trafficking, mandated report and requires an investigation. Sexual exploitation that does not involve a third party does not require a mandated report or an investigation unless a parent or caregiver or household member is involved in the sexual exploitation of the child. Labor trafficking, likewise, is not a mandated report in Minnesota and does not require an investigation or assessment, but all minors who experience labor trafficking or forms of sexual exploitation that don't fall into investigation are crime victims, so there should still be an offer of voluntary child welfare services. Okay, so that's kind of all your context. We have some, I think, pretty great resources on our website, including our best practice guide, our safety plan, which is available in 9 languages, service planning guide, and also our new bulletin about the policy related to out-of-home placement that we're going to be discussing today, as well as a number of tools, one of which Darian will go over with you. So you can access all of this either through the slides right here. There are links on this slide, or also you can access them at our DHS Safe Harbor website under either the Child Welfare tab or the Family First tab, depending on what you're looking for. Okay, so now let's get into the nitty-gritty. Okay, so since the beginning, many of you, if you've been involved in Safe Harbor for long at all, you are aware that we've had lots of conversations over the years about the need for shelter, the need for housing, the need for better processes for placement, the need for better coordination around placement. There have been lots of gaps, both in the broad child welfare system placement side of things, and also within what we have available through Safe Harbor, especially, and this information really our Safe Harbor leadership team has kind of observed, and this is something that when I've co-presented with Dina Chu on this topic, these are some of the things that she often presents as kind of gaps, things that we still are struggling with within our safe harbor, shelter, and housing, and like what we have available for resources in our state. So things like mental health or chemical health treatment and stabilization programs, specific programming for males, culturally specific shelter or housing programs, shelter and housing that is able to meet the needs of individuals with disabilities who are experiencing trafficking or exploitation, and shelter or housing out-of-home placement options for individuals with dependent children. So for survivors who are in that 24 and under age range who would qualify for safe harbor, but they have children. So our hope is that I'm giving you some of the big picture ahead here as far as what we're hoping to accomplish with these changes related to the Family First Prevention Services Act. And by making these changes and having more programs available to serve sex trafficked, commercially sexually exploited, and at-risk youth, we hope that we will be able to start, this will be one of the ways that we can start filling some of these specific gaps that we have been experiencing in our states. Okay, so those are the specific gaps and problems that we are trying to kind of chip away at through making the changes that I'm about to discuss related to Family First. But the Family First Prevention Services Act is actually even trying to address broader concerns, okay, that involve the entire foster care system in the United States. So I put up a couple of images here from the Casey Family Foundation, and there are updated reports just from 2021 on the Casey Family Foundation website if you're interested in learning more about some of the trends related to children going into the foster care system in the United States. So these are a couple of the things that actually really specifically led to Congress passing the Family First Prevention Services Act. So one, there has been an increase in the number of children who have been going into the foster care system, particularly in the last 10 years or so. Even though there had been a bit of a decrease for a while, there has been now again an increase in that. And Congress was concerned with that. What can we do in order to keep children with their families in their communities and not have them removed? And in particular, the other image here shows that in fact one of the biggest areas of concern has been that many children who have gone into foster care in the last decade have been going into congregate group home settings, particularly with disabilities, with severe mental illness, but there has not really been a lot of good process at all around making sure that these children are in the least restrictive setting and making sure that there are not other community or family resources first where these children could find the stability that they need and could find a safe place to be. And so those are some of the things that this law has been trying to address. I will mention too that, that looks different in every state. So if we look at the numbers here in Minnesota, they may vary slightly, and we have additional problems that we face. One of the major additional issues that is really, really challenging that we are heavily focused on right now within the Child Safety and Permanency Division is trying to reduce some of the disparities in out-of-home placement of American Indian and African American children and youth. And so that's another layer to kind of what needs to happen, what needs to change, and what are the opportunities presented by this law. Okay, so now to the specifics. How are out-of-home placements by child protection agencies impacted by the Family First law? So this law actually limits federal funding for non-family settings. That means settings that are not relatives and they are not family foster homes. They are instead any type of group setting for a child to be placed in. Instead, and this is just really brief, but instead, part of the funding that used to go to that type of placement is being diverted into placement prevention services, which is a whole nother side of the law that hopefully we'll be able to talk about in the future as that is developed. But this federal funding now for these group types of foster care placement is only allowed under certain conditions. So basically, in order to place a child, in order for a child welfare agency to put a child into a group home setting and get federal reimbursement for it, they now have to be certified to be a specialized setting to meet specific needs of certain populations of youth. So there are 4 new specific types of settings. Programs, group setting, group residential programs that do not fall into any of these new 4 categories will not be able to receive this type of federal reimbursement called Title IV-E reimbursement through the placing agency. And in other words, what that is going to do is that basically agencies who place children may not have resources to place kids any longer in facilities, residential programs that do not fall into one of these categories, okay? So the 4 categories are qualified residential treatment programs, programs that are independent, they're supervised independent living programs for youth who are ages 18 to 21, programs for pregnant or parenting youth, and then the 4th type, the one that we're about to zero in on, is settings providing high quality residential care and supportive services to children and youth who have been found to be or are at risk of becoming sex trafficking victims. That is the federal language that creates this specific type of programming. Now, what did we do here in Minnesota to implement this? And big, huge asterisk, because I'm not going to go into the qualified residential treatment programs, supervised independent living programs, or pregnant and parenting youth programs, unless people have specific questions about them. I will direct you to and provide a link at the end to our Minnesota Child Welfare Training Academy website that has recorded webinars and resources about each of the different types of programs and also all of the different process requirements and certification requirements and all of that. So I'll provide that at the end. We're going to now zoom in on these new type of residential programs designed to serve sex trafficked, commercially sexually exploited, or at-risk youth. Okay, so one, I think really for this group, a really important anchor point before we go into the process and how kids are placed here and why and when and what the programs will do, I want to pull us back, kind of zoom out again for just a moment to situate us again. I know these are big changes that we're talking about, but to situate us again in kind of really as we've developed all of this, what do we have our eye on in terms of impact for children and youth in our state who experience exploitation and trafficking? I will tell you honestly that as Darianne and I have been leading the development of these residential programs and the definitions that Darianne will share about and the certification language, all of this, the training, everything that we've developed around this really has been oriented and focused heavily upon what survivor subject matter experts and youth, as well as people who are already currently working with trafficked and exploited youth in residential settings, what they really say that youth need and where the opportunities are with this. So what are some of the impacts that we hope to have as we develop these new specialized residential programs? Some short-term impacts and some long-term impacts. Short-term, as we create these programs and certify them, and as they develop and start to serve youth who have been trafficked or exploited or who are at risk, the basic impact short term is that this population of youth will have more access to staff in residential programs who are trained on trafficking and exploitation. And they will, because of the way that we set up the requirement, they will all trafficked, exploited, or at-risk youth placed in one of these settings will have access to human trafficking prevention education. Every single program is required to offer it. Second, we hope that through all of the training that we're doing and setting up this network of providers across the state, we really hope that there will be much better awareness in residential programs of Safe Harbor and better access to Safe Harbor funded services, better connection to Safe Harbor protocol teams, better relationship between our Safe Harbor funded programs and other residential programs that maybe are able to meet the needs of other youth, et cetera. So better connection with Safe Harbor. And third, short-term impact, honestly, better services and quite frankly, more funding in residential programs to specifically meet the needs of trafficked, exploited, and at-risk youth, in addition to our existing Safe Harbor funding that operates in a little bit different way and still will go on to operate that way. But this kind of layers in on top of it to add additional resources. Long-term impact, because of the way that we have focused this on prevention of trafficking and the way that we have defined the term youth at risk for sex trafficking or commercial sexual exploitation, we honestly hope that long-term that we will be able to prevent trafficking from happening for youth who are identified as at risk and do end up in child welfare placement and in one of these programs. We hope that trafficking will be prevented. Another thing that was kind of not an initial impact that we had in mind, but through the process, we've discovered that just by widening the range and requiring training for so many people, there is actually huge potential to change some of the misinformation and some of the narrative around our state about, and the stigma about who is a victim of trafficking and who is at risk of trafficking, and even what trafficking and exploitation look like. And then finally, we hope that this will, as I mentioned before, help to fill in some of the gaps on our continuum of care for trafficked, exploited, and at-risk youth, both in community-based services and also in residential services. Okay, so Family First implementation. Basically, we've had several hundred people working with us over the last couple of years to try and develop the required definition. So I showed you that federal language before. The interesting thing was that the federal law did not define what it means to be a youth at risk of becoming a victim of sex trafficking. So every state has had to define that for themselves. And also did not define what it means for a program to offer supportive services and high quality residential care for this population of youth. So we have brought together a lot of different stakeholders to develop that together and to implement it together. So this has been generally the process. The first thing that we had to do in order to implement this law was to define the population. What does it mean for a child, and how do we identify that a youth has been a victim of sex trafficking or commercial sexual exploitation, or that they are a youth at risk of becoming a victim of sex trafficking or commercial sexual exploitation. So once we defined those populations and created ways for child welfare to identify those youth and document that they've been identified as meeting any of those definitions, then we had to figure out, well, what are the needs of these youth in residential programs? What would be most effective in a specialized residential setting? From there, we had to develop the service standards, right? So these are the needs. Now, how do those translate into requirements for residential programs. And then we made them requirements by putting that into statute. And in this last session, the licensing statute 245A.25 created all of these certification requirements for the 4 new residential settings. And then finally, we are now in the stage of really implementing, providing technical assistance around this and continuing to develop best practice guidance and providing all of the layers of required training for folks who will be working directly in these residential programs and for our child welfare staff who will be making these placements. Okay, so last thing before I hand things off to Darianne, so when we talk about assessing the needs and developing the service standards, we really our group of stakeholders really looked first at some of the recent research that has come out. And that is, you can see the picture of it here. This report was published by the Public Consulting Group, and they looked at existing research and worked with programs around the U.S. to try and put together a list of key considerations for developing this type of specialized residential program. So what did they find? They found that trafficked, exploited, and at-risk youth in a residential placement setting there are specific considerations and needs around safety, both physical and emotional safety. There is really a need for trained staff to provide care in these settings. They cannot just go into they're not going to be as successful in a program with staff that has no training on identifying trafficking or exploitation or grooming. And so that is an essential component. They need to have access to specialized services related to the trafficking, exploitation, or risk that they are experiencing. And as we know, within our Safe Harbor network and within all of our protocol team development work, there is really a need for higher levels of collaboration and communication with all of the providers who are working with youth who've experienced trafficking or exploitation. And then finally, all youth should be given access to human trafficking prevention education if they are in one of these specialized settings. So that was kind of the big picture of what the research told us and what we adopted here in Minnesota as kind of the core components to specialized residential care for, you see the acronym up here, ST, sex trafficked, commercially sexually exploited, or at-risk youth. All right, so Darianne, Darianne, are you available to take over on this slide right now? Sorry, and Siri thought that she needed to take for a moment.
Yeah, yep, I'm in my third spot of the house now, so hopefully it remains quiet here. Sorry, and let me pull my microphone out so it's a little bit more clear. Okay, so I'm going to talk about that placement process and what child welfare workers and people making out-of-home placements through a county or tribal agency would be doing. So first, there's the identification process where counties and tribes will need to identify youth using the state definition and determine the eligibility. And I'll go over that in a little bit further in the next slides. Those definitions were developed within the subwork group process for specialized settings. And then caseworkers would discuss the needs and the preferences with the youth and their family and decide whether, what is a safe and appropriate setting and if that is to be placed in a specialized setting. So really looking at that individualized assessment for the youth and the needs of the youth. And next, workers will need to document within SSIS the placement eligibility within the first 2 weeks of that out-of-home placement. In addition to that, there would need to be the placement authority, which could include a CHIPS petition or a voluntary placement agreement. Sarah, I don't think I can advance the slides. Thank you. Okay. So for identification purposes, the youth would need to be identified by a child welfare worker, that they are currently or previously involved in commercial sexual activity. There may or may not be a third-party trafficker. And then youth who are considered to be at risk of sex trafficking or commercial sexual exploitation. This is where the subwork group developed the definition of what those risk factors include. So the primary risk factors, if a youth has one of these factors, they would be considered to be at risk and qualify for a specialized setting. So if they've had commercial or non-commercial sexual exploitation, if they're connected with others who exchange sex for anything of value, if they're experiencing wage theft or labor trafficking or exploitation. I'm going to pause for a second. Is my audio okay, Sarah?
I do hear a little background noise, but I can hear your voice.
I'll speak louder. I can't do anything about the background noise right now. Sorry. And then these are the joys of working from home. Secondary risk factors include experiences such as a history of abuse or trauma, history of homelessness, drug use, or family conflict and gang affiliation. And then we really want to make sure that that workers are taking into consideration the intersectionality that come with systemic oppression, cultural identity, racism, and white supremacy within systems. And Hunter touched on it earlier in his presentation, that it's really important for us to keep those considerations in mind, and that those factors do increase the risk of trafficking and exploitation. Sorry. Okay, so this is, as Sarah mentioned earlier, on the DHS Safe Harbor website, there are a lot of resources and handouts, all kinds of things, including our best practice guide. But then there's also this new document and identification guide that is to help workers when they're in the process of determining eligibility and making that out-of-home placement in a specialized setting for sex trafficking or commercial sexual exploitation. And this can be found on the DHS website. I believe it's under the Family First tab. Oh, and sorry, Sarah, can you go back to that for a second too? Sorry. I just wanted to point out that these are also, for any child welfare folks that are on this meeting right now, these are also some of the factors that you'll be finding within SSIS to document the eligibility and the out-of-home placement. Okay, sorry. Can I pause for a moment and switch rooms again? I'm sorry. Or Sarah, do you want to talk about this slide and talk about that workers really need to look at the least restrictive setting? Let me move rooms if you want to do this. Sorry.
Sure. So after Darianne explained the overall process for making a placement decision when, kind of considering these specialized residential settings as an option. So overall, our guidance and state law when it comes to placement is that the best interest factors have to be evaluated by the placing agency in deciding which placement setting is most appropriate for the child that they are trying to place, the child or youth. And so some of the best interest factors that we find particularly relevant in terms of trafficked, exploited, and at-risk youth, which we've highlighted and explained a little more in our best practice guide, are these community and family connections, ability to meet the specific medical, mental health, and chemical health needs of the child, as well as their individual needs and their cultural needs based on their background, and then of course their history of and their current trauma and abuse related to the trafficking and exploitation. Darianne, do you want to talk about these particular kind of two safety-related factors that are often considered when it comes to trafficked and exploited and at-risk youth?
Sure. One of the things that needs to be considered as well as the possible recruitment of other children. We know that this does happen. Sorry, my house is so loud today. Dog's barking now. And so these are considerations specific to this population to really think about when deciding whether a specialized placement is appropriate or the best option for the youth. And also the concerns of risk of absenting from either home or the placement that is chosen. We really do, like as child welfare workers, we really look at keeping youth within their community. But sometimes those are things that we really have to consider and balance with the need for out-of-home placement and whether there is either the risk of absenting or possibly a trafficker picking them up from the placement location. Okay, so when would a specialized setting maybe not be the right fit for youth? As child welfare professionals are considering the possibility of out-of-home placement, they do need to consider the least restrictive setting. And so what that might look like is there a family member, or can the youth remain at home with access to adequate community supports if there is a caregiver that's able to keep that child safe and have them connected to community supports. This is especially important to consider in cases where ICWA and NISPA, where ICWA and NISPA requirements are something that the Child Welfare Agency has to consider. Additionally, if there's concerns of substance abuse concerns or possible a higher need of mental health concerns, those are things that also need to be taken into consideration when determining the most appropriate placement for a youth.
Okay, so I'm going to quickly cruise through these last few slides here. I know, Caroline, we have until 10:15, right? I believe.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, so in the next couple minutes, I just want to mention a couple, I want to kind of fill in the gaps as far as some of the statutory changes and the residential programs that we have so far since September 30th available to provide these services. So first, one of the statutory changes that went into effect in this last session is a new training requirement. All staff in the entire state who have child protective duties under our Minnesota child protection statutes must take this approved training that we are creating regarding trafficking and exploitation and risk. This will enable workers, all child welfare workers, to be able to identify and to make appropriate placement decisions related to youth who've been trafficked, exploited, or at risk. And we did also create these certification standards, which I mentioned are in 245A.25. So these are the standards for these new specialized programs. They have to have a trauma-informed model of care. It has to be a safe setting designed to prevent ongoing and future trafficking. There needs to be individual, equitable, and culturally responsive services. And the program has to be able to work with the youth to access individualized services, in addition to providing educational, life skills, and employment supports, and offering a trafficking prevention education curriculum for all youth who are in the program. And finally, all staff in these residential programs who have direct contact with youth must be trained on trafficking and exploitation. This is a little bit more about that training requirement. We have so far disseminated a list of training options for some of the basic training, including connections to the 9 Safe Harbor regional navigators, and a number of good online resources for really basic training on trafficking and exploitation and Safe Harbor. In addition to that, though, there is a required training that will be available publicly online beginning in November for direct contact services staff to take. Then finally, we have been partnering with Love 146 and with our Safe Harbor network to provide scholarships for residential facility staff who want to be certified facilitators of Not a Number human trafficking prevention education curriculum. And we have given out 38 scholarships to facility staff. We will have another round of scholarships available coming in January. And in the second round, if we do not have sufficient facility staff who apply for scholarships, in that second round, we may be able to provide some scholarships for community-based providers who work directly with youth who are in residential programs also. All right, so a couple things to consider here. That Safe Harbor, as I mentioned, Safe Harbor funded programs still will exist, and there will be a big variety of different types of programming and service delivery models, including some programs who serve all sex trafficked, exploited, and at-risk youth, and other programs that maybe serve only at-risk youth, and they may or may not be integrated with other youth who are in that same program. So there could be a lot of different models that programs consider depending on the youth that they serve and depending on their setting. So we right now, as of last week, we had 14 programs. We now have 18 programs across Minnesota as of right now that are certified to serve as specialized settings to serve sex trafficked, commercially sexually exploited, and at-risk youth. I know that there, as of last week, had been a total of 22 applications, but we do see more coming in every day. I do want to mention that children who have been in a placement prior to September 30th are still able to continue in that placement without any of these new requirements or certification factors kind of being at play. But any new placements after beginning on September 30th would have to be in order for a youth to be placed in one of these certified settings, they would have to be identified as a youth who has experienced sex trafficking or commercial sexual exploitation or who is at risk. All right, so you can, if you want to be a nerd like me, you can also go to the licensing information lookup website every 2 hours, every day of the week to check how many programs are now certified. And it is all public information. You can search for children's residential facilities and then actually select sex trafficked, commercially sexually exploited, or at-risk youth if you want to know which programs are certified. We do have programs across the entire state and serving a variety of youth. We have a number of programs specifically, I want to mention, that only serve adolescent male youth, which is a new thing for kind of filling in one of those gaps. And thank you, Paula and Caroline, for putting the resources here. I will put the link to licensing information lookup in the chat as well. And with that, I know I'm way out of time, so I'm going to end. Here is our contact information, and I'll put the licensing lookup website. I actually searched for our specialized setting already, so it looks kind of scary and crazy, but if you click on that, that might work. Let me see if I can put a cleaner link. Caroline, thanks for the time today, and I'm happy to answer questions by email afterwards too if folks have more questions. I do see Christy Cobb just posted one. Do I have time to answer that, Caroline, or should I follow up with her separately?
No, go ahead, Sarah. That's fine.
Okay, so absolutely. Thank you, Christy, for pointing this out, that both facilities that are licensed by the Department of Corrections or by Department of Human Services are eligible to become certified settings. The only limitation is that DOC licensed facilities that are corrections facilities are not eligible, but other DOC licensed facilities are. So absolutely, yes. We are working with a number of DOC facilities. I believe that of the 18, maybe 6 or 7 actually are DOC facilities that are certified so far. And I know of a couple others that have applied. So I think it's a fantastic idea to coordinate more and provide some training for probation officers. Honestly, our required training for residential facilities is going to be publicly available, and even that training may be very helpful for probation officers as well, as they are making decisions about placing youth who are on the juvenile delinquency side. And likewise for our child welfare required training. Honestly, that training could also be very helpful for probation officers who are making decisions pertaining to placement. Any other questions?
Just checking here the chat to see if there's anything else. Doesn't look like it. All right. Great. Well, thank you so much, Sarah and Ariane, for all of your great detailed information here this morning. And people know how to get in touch with you if they have more questions, but this is a great new development for Safe Harbor in the state, and I'm really excited to see how it works out, having more options for youth in the system response.
Thanks, Caroline.
Sure thing, thanks. Oh, wait, we have a quick question.
There was a question.
Helena, why don't you, it was in the Q&A. Oh, sorry, okay.
Oh,
I'm sorry I missed that.
sorry.
Okay. You are using the Q&A the way it should be. Okay, I'm curious, what is the definition of family used by the Family First Act? I'm wondering where would fictive kin caregivers fit in? I'm not sure what fictive kin is, but I'm thinking kinship caregivers, so.
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. So I did mention at the beginning that these changes only apply to non-family settings. Now, honestly, they're geared at congregate settings. So any type of an out-of-home placement in a family foster home or any type of kinship setting would not be subject to any of these requirements. And I will tell you that already in statute here in Minnesota, the term kin and kinship placement is very, very broad. Darianne, you probably could give a couple examples really quick of that. It's a super broad definition, does not have to be related by blood to be kin, right, Darianne?
Yep, yeah, just exactly how Helena explained it, is that chosen family does not necessarily have to be blood related. So we know that there are some families where there might be an auntie or an uncle or somebody who is really close to that child and family, but isn't necessarily blood related, and that would be considered as kin. And so that is, when looking at least restrictive settings, that is something that child welfare professionals do take into consideration. And so all of these changes around Family First, the out-of-home placement process is specifically for congregate or group care settings. And so when we look at, and then there's a whole other side of Family First, for prevention services that looks at prevention of the actual out-of-home placement. And that also will be focusing on those kin placements and supporting children and families with those, whether it's family or a kin arrangement. So good question.
Great, thank you. And I learned a new term today, fictive. Okay, great. There is one more quick question here from Mary Cowan. Sarah, when in the licensing lookup, how do you look up CSEY certified programs? I don't see it in the drop-down options.
Yeah, so Mary, so if you go to children's residential facilities for the license type, then like a grid of maybe 12 different checkboxes will pop up, and then you just choose, it's in the far right column, sex trafficked, commercially sexually exploited, and at risk. However, I will tell you sometimes the website is wonky and you need to just reload it. I think that nerds like me are using it way too much, so it's getting overwhelmed. So, but yeah, just it should pop up. Just make sure you're in the right license type.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. All right, great. I am just going to give a couple of very quick updates on Safe Harbor before we go for the day. First of all, I put in the chat a link to a new article from the Harvard Public Health Review, just speaking of not a number, MDH and Love 146, which puts together the not a number curriculum, created an article for that particular review. It just came out, so we're really excited about that. And it's a nice opportunity to get an overview of what the Not a Number program does and how we are using it through our Safe Harbor system here in Minnesota. So please check that out. I also just wanted to let you know about some upcoming trainings. These are timely after the presentation that Hunter provided this morning. We are in the process right now of putting together a series of trainings that will be a little bit later on this fall, early winter. One will be looking at working with youth who have disabilities. Another will be looking at working with survivors who have dissociative identity disorder. And finally, we are working on putting together a couple of trainings on working with transgender youth. So please stay on the lookout for those. And finally, we also have a healthcare training, a virtual healthcare training that is in its final few weeks of being put together. And that will be available for anybody, but really it's specifically tailored to folks who are working in hospital settings and community clinics. And we also have our evaluation for Safe Harbor, which is in the process of being finalized. And we are going to have a special webinar for that evaluation report, likely at the end of November. So please stay on the lookout for the date and time for that as well. And then finally, in Safe Harbor, we're also in the final process of putting together an update of our grantee guide. So for everybody who is on the line who is a Safe Harbor grantee, your updated guidebook will be coming in the next few weeks. So busy times, but lots of good things coming on the horizon. I want to thank everybody for joining us this morning. I want to thank all of our speakers, Hunter Beckstrom, Darian McCormick, and Sarah Ladd, for sharing very important information with us today. Please be sure to follow up with them if you have any questions. Be sure to also fill out the feedback form for our Safe Harbor Human Trafficking Task Force meeting today. We greatly value your feedback, and we really like to have ideas for future meetings too. So have a great day and a happy Halloween, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.